Thank you, Todd. And I like the vacation idea. I'm all for that. What do you think, Scott?
I think it's a wonderful idea. I'm down with that as well.
So speaking of all of that, I thought I'd lead off with a little bit of humor. Many of you may have seen the movie Back to the Future, and there was a little cartoon clip I saw on Facebook a month or so ago, and it had a picture of the car, the DeLorean car, and the doc was sitting in the driver's seat, and he's pointing to the apparatus, the computer, and he says, "Now, whatever you do, don't program in 2020." I thought that's completely appropriate for what we're going through today. But today we're talking about saving the 1031 exchanges. So a couple opening comments. Number one, I've been doing this for 36 years. You go back 36 years, and I think just about every administration and every Congress has tried to adjust or amend or revise or revoke 1031 exchanges over that time frame. I think there's maybe one or two that didn't try that. So it's important to note that this is not a Democratic versus a Republican issue. This is an educational issue. And so today we're going to talk about where we're at today, what we're seeing today, what it looks like today. And then from there, we can kind of expand upon all of that in terms of what the threat to 1031 exchange is in, and most importantly, what each of you can individually do. So a quick history, it seems like every 3 to 4 or 5 years, either the current administration or the current Congress will try to amend or significantly reduce or even eliminate 1031 exchanges. And so that's what we're looking at again today. And we've always been able to sit down and educate parties on both sides of the aisle as to what the benefits of the 1031 exchange are and what the repercussions would be should anything be reduced or completely eliminated. So with that, Joe Biden has just proposed significantly reducing the 1031 exchanges such that if you make more than $400,000 in a given year, you would not be able to do the 1031 exchange. If you make less than $400,000 per year, you would qualify for 1031 exchange treatment. I don't think they've clearly defined what that is, what that means, what you make. And usually that means adjusted gross income. So it's very possible that a lot of people who make less than 400,000 in a given year would actually make more than 400,000 in that year when they sell real property. The capital gain is part of your adjusted gross income and puts you right into that category. And Scott, do you want to kind of go over the details in terms of the plan he's proposed?
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. Welcome. I'm Scott Saunders with Asset Preservation, and Bill and I've known each other. He's got me beat by a few years in the business with 36 years. I maybe have 32, but back then we both had a full head of hair. So look what the business has done to us.
That's the reason.
That's what it is. It's the stress of all these administrations coming after 1031. Hey, welcome everybody. We're really excited to talk about this topic, about the importance of 1031, what's been proposed. And I think what Bill mentioned is really key. What each one of you can do to help preserve and educate people in Congress about 1031 exchanges. So broadly speaking, Joe Biden has a tax plan, and it has a whole bunch of things in it, things related to ordinary income, things related to capital gains, potentially step up in basis. The focus here is what is he proposing as it relates to Section 1031. So what he proposed was a new spending plan, and the new spending plan would cost about $775 billion. So it's not an inexpensive proposal, and it would be providing care for younger kids, early ages, and then elder care. Now, to help pay for that, you typically in the code, when you get a new spending plan, what you want to do is look for what are called offsets, ways that we can pay for it. And as Bill mentioned very well, what we're seeing now, we see this every few years. There was something with the Trump administration years ago where they were looking at something called immediate expensing. So keep in mind, even though it has Joe Biden's name on it, it really is more people in government looking at 1031 and saying, boy, we can pick up some revenue and we can use that revenue to pay for other programs, whatever that might be. So in this case, Joe Biden looked at 1031 and the $400,000 threshold, part of his overall tax plan is to not increase taxes on those unless they're making over 400,000. So that's why that number. The reason, and Bill kind of alluded to it, why it really affects pretty much everybody is that you could be, let's say, an average earner, middle class, making a middle class salary, husband and wife. But if you sell one property where Bill's located in San Diego that you've held for any period of time, it's going to bump you up and take up your taxable income into a higher category. So it'll bump you up into that higher tax bracket for that year, most likely meaning you wouldn't get any benefit. So Joe Biden has proposed this. It costs $775 billion, B with a big B. What's interesting, we just got some new scoring last week from the Joint Committee on Taxation, and they scored different things in the tax code, home interest deduction. And one of the things they scored was Section 1031. Over a 5-year window, their estimate is that there's about a $41 billion, what they call tax expenditure for exchanges taking place, meaning there's revenue that doesn't come into the Treasury because people do 1031 exchanges. But that kind of highlights the problem. We're talking 41 billion, and yet the tax spending plan is 775 billion. So we're not even close to beginning to pay for it. So that's the proposal. You've probably seen over the last few months, a lot of organizations are talking about this. So people that are involved with DST ownership, fractional ownership have brought it up, NAR, a whole real estate coalition of different groups. So there are a lot of groups coming together to try and educate our representatives in Congress on the economic benefits. And we'll talk a little bit about those specifically, but I can tell you Bill's company and ours, we're both part of what's called the Federation of Exchange Accommodators, which is a mouthful of a name. But, right, Bill? It's a big name.
That's so true. Yeah.
But we've been with them. They're the National 1031 Exchange Trade Organization. And I can tell you for all of this year, the people that are in the Government Affairs Committee have been meeting with people in Congress. And a lot of them have been on the Democratic side of the aisle, seeing that there was likely maybe a change in, we see things change, right? Administrations change, Congress and the makeup of Congress changes. And so we've been meeting. In fact, I've got a meeting today at 3 with a senator for 30 minutes, only to talk about 1031. And so we probably had in excess of 30 meetings with different people in Congress. And what we're trying to do is educate them on what does 1031 do for commercial real estate? What does it do for the small investor, the large investor, for farmers, for the whole segment? And Bill and I will be sharing some data on that, but we've really been able to kind of open their eyes. I think most of them that I've met with may have heard of 1031. And Bill, you probably hear this term, right? It's a tax loophole, right?
Yep.
We sometimes hear that, and we spend a lot of time trying to educate them on what does 1031 do for commercial real estate. And particularly in this environment where we've got this pandemic, commercial real estate in many areas is really suffering. Look at the hospitality industry or retail. We really need tools in the code to help people repurpose real estate assets, right? Office buildings or maybe hotels that are just not going to see their intended use. 1031 is a really vital tool to help with that. Now, let's get back to kind of the thread. I kind of got off base there, and I'll maybe cue it up for Bill here in a moment. But one of the big unknowns right now, so we've had an election. We all know how the votes came out, and we all know there's a little bit of chaos. There are some challenges going on there. But one of the things that it stands right now, when we look at a tax plan, the makeup of Congress is such that the House is as a majority Democrat. We've got Joe Biden, who is the presumed president-elect to do the executive branch. And then we've got the Senate. And right now, we don't know what the makeup of the Senate is going to be. There's a runoff in Georgia where two senators are going to face off, and that'll happen in early January. And then we're going to get the makeup of what the Senate looks like. And that's really important across the board, because if you have a new president and they've got a tax plan they want to implement, but they have a Senate that's maybe not in the majority of their party, they're going to have to compromise and work together. It's not going to be a slam dunk that all of the proposals that Joe Biden originally had will necessarily happen. Do you want to kind of speak to that, Bill?
Absolutely. And I want to go back real quick when you were talking about meeting with senators, and this is kind of a funny story, but it brings home the educational barrier that we're up against. And I think you also know Dan Wagner with Inland, and Dan was back meeting with some congressmen, and he had walked in for his 11 o'clock a.m. appointment, and the young intern there greeted him, and Dan said, "I'm here to talk about 1031." And the guy said, "No, it's 11 o'clock. So a lot of them aren't even aware of what the 1031 exchange is. And so that's the educational hurdle that we have to really go through. I think, a lot of folks are concerned about the 1031 exchange, and we certainly have to take it seriously. We have to make sure that we meet with everyone that we can meet with who has some type of a vote that might count, and educate them on what the 1031 exchange is all about. And Scott summarized it really, really well, which is it looks like we're going to have a Democratic controlled executive branch. We have a Democratic controlled House of Representatives. And the most likely outcome seems to be a Republican control of the Senate, which from my perspective is actually a good thing. I think having one party in control of everything is worrisome. And this way we have some really good checks and balances. And really the next step would be for, once all the dust settles and we have a new administration, if they're going to make any changes, they submit that through the legislative process. It will get introduced to the House of Representatives. It goes through their committee and goes through their process. And we assume that they would vote in favor of these type of changes. It would then go to the Senate, and the Senate would have to vote. And assuming that it remains under Republican control, the Senate would probably vote that down. So it's probably good news. It's probably a good check and balance for what we're looking at today. But obviously, like Scott said, there's a lot of just unanswered questions and unanswered issues right now. So there a lot of changes could go either direction. So today we still need to take it seriously. And even after the dust is settled, we need to take it seriously, because if we don't, something like this could squeak through and then surprise a lot of folks. So we need to make sure that we educate everyone as to what the benefits of the 1031 exchange are. And more importantly, maybe what would happen if it actually did go through. So to kind of maybe put it in layman's terms so that you all have talking points that you can use when you're talking to clients and their advisors and what have you. And if you have connections in Congress or the administration, what you can use to kind of go through the talking points. First, as an example, over the years, we've done surveys and studies with our clients. And what we found is if 1031 exchanges were to go away completely, usually 60% or more would indicate I just wouldn't sell. As Scott alluded to, there's, the 1031 exchange allows investors to diversify or consolidate their investment portfolio. It allows them to reposition, and especially coming out of COVID-19, although I'm not sure we could say coming out of it yet, but when we come out of COVID-19, there's going to be a lot of retail office space and retail and office space that needs to be repurposed, and the 1031 exchange allows that. If we have a lot of folks that say, wait a minute, if I can't defer my taxes, if I'm going to repurpose and get killed on taxes, I just won't sell. And if that happens, now you have, two title companies, two escrow companies, an exchange company, lenders, appraisers, et cetera, that don't do their work, and they don't make any revenue and they don't pay taxes. So in the long run, it actually works out to be a revenue loser as opposed to a revenue raiser. And that's really the talking point that we need to hit home, is that this is not what they think it is. Scott, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, Bill, I totally agree with you that once they understand what the exchange does for the markets, they don't understand this. So you've got an analysis when you look at collecting revenue. People make decisions based upon tax issues. So some of the assumptions are, well, okay, we'll get rid of the exchange and people will just sell and pay taxes. And we know in the marketplace that investors make decisions based upon tax consequences. So if I've got an asset that I've owned for 20 or 30 years with a lot of gain, and I am facing a big tax hit, you know what I might do? I might say, forget it. I'll just stay with that asset and I won't sell it. Maybe I'll refi it, pull a little equity out, but instead of transferring it. Now, what does that do for you as real estate professionals, right? You and the industry depends upon transactional activity, right? We're turning over assets, we're moving, we're relocating, and Bill and I will get into this in a little bit later of kind of what we're seeing going on in the marketplace, because it's been a fascinating year on 1031 activity. So we'll get you up to speed, but there's some really interesting shifts taking place. Circling back to Congress and what happens, one of the things that still is an unknown. So Bill mentioned we've got the unknown of the makeup, but maybe Congress is going to lean. The Senate was probably leaning, or most people think it's leaning the Republicans. We have a whole nother issue, which is, let's say we have a new presidential administration. What's their top priority? It seems like addressing the COVID-19 pandemic is a pretty top priority. So is this the right time to necessarily do major tax policy, right? Increase taxes when we've got millions and millions of people unemployed and struggling and businesses shutting down. So I'll tell you, in talking with people in Congress, there's certainly a lot of people that say, hey, we really want to tackle one thing at a time. Maybe we don't tackle taxes first. Maybe we deal with the pandemic and the virus and get the economy working. And maybe it's a matter of circling back in a year or two to dealing with tax policy. So, kind of keep that in mind. That's really important. What we find out in talking to people, and it's interesting, Bill mentioned the 1031 on the watch. A lot of times some of the staff have no idea what a 1031 is. So even the tax staff or legislative staff, they really don't know. There's that perception that it's a loophole. Well, one thing that's really kind of interesting coming up this year, so we're sitting here in November of 2020, we've had exchanges in the code for 99 years. So next year, we're going to celebrate 100 years in the tax code, which means the exchange has been around and it's helped rural America, it's helped cities, it's helped small investors, but it's been around through all sorts of economic cycles, and it really helps people, gives them a tool to dispose of an asset, reinvest and redeploy all that capital into a better performing property. And it's a great tool to do that. When you think of how important that is on the commercial market, as I think most of the people that are participating and listening here know on the commercial market, give you some data. Somewhere between 20 to 30% of all commercial exchanges involve an exchange. So it's either on the sale of an asset or it's somebody exchanging into a replacement property. So it's basically close to a third of the market is involving a 1031. That's just on commercial. Think about the market for ag and ranches. People that are in the Midwest would not be able to, they'd be devastated if they had to sell and pay the taxes. It would have a huge implication. And then the part of the market that Bill and I see, we've both done this for decades now, single family, the broad majority, if you look at our business and I would say well over half of our transactions, closer to 60%, are single family investors. They've got one single family home that they bought and it's appreciated and they're going to exchange it for two more. So that's a part of it that, as people in Congress learn that it's really the small investor as well as commercial, but a lot of our transactions are people that are just going to provide for their retirement income by having a few single family homes or maybe a small multifamily. So there's this, unfortunately, and Bill, I'm sure you've seen this, and I'll cycle back. I don't want to get partisan, but there are some people that are Democrats that go, well, what about Donald Trump? People don't understand that developers can't really use a 1031 exchange on development property. It's got to be held for investment. So the optics sometimes are, well, hey, Donald Trump, and Donald Trump has done a couple of exchanges from what we know, a couple is documented, but most developers are paying the taxes on properties that they develop. So it's not something where you've got, the rich fat cats just taking advantage of it. And that's something that we've really spent time educating people on. And I'll share one statistic and then kind of kick it back to you, Bill. But one data point, we've had a couple of studies, and Bill and I will talk about these, but two professors studied 1.6 million exchange transactions. So Professors Ling and Petrova did a microeconomic study, and they looked at these over a long period of time. And you know what they found out? They found out that when people do an exchange, 88% of the time, they sell that replacement property that was acquired. So it's a timing mechanism to push back paying taxes to redeploy it. But a lot of times people are going to go ahead and then ultimately sell. That taxable revenue goes back to the government on that property that's appreciated. So it doesn't go away. It doesn't vanish. It's just a timing mechanism. They're going to get it later. And then here's one other data point I'll just share with you that I think is important. 1/3 of the investors on this study pay some taxable boot when they do an exchange. So they sell an asset for $1 million and they buy a replacement property, let's say for $800,000, and that roughly $200,000 difference they pay taxes on. So 1/3 of all the investors are paying taxes in the year that they do an exchange. So the Treasury is still getting tax revenue from that.
I think that's a really good point, because that also brings home some of the economic benefits. I mean, a lot of people look at the 1031 exchange as a tax code, which it is, but it's really an economic stimulus package in a way as well. So what Scott mentioned is it puts liquidity in the real estate market. It keeps everything going. It keeps the transaction volume up there. And then, of course, like he pointed out, is about 1/3 of them pay some type of tax each time that occurs. If they didn't sell, they wouldn't be collecting any of those tax revenues. So it actually, from that perspective, it keeps that liquidity going and keeps the market moving. It's a huge economic stimulus. And coming out of COVID-19, we're going to need that stimulus. The other issue that a lot of folks that I've heard out there talking about this don't address the issue of state and county and local governments. If you think about that, especially here in California, we have Prop 13, it kind of freezes your property tax cost basis, but different jurisdictions are different, of course. But in a lot of cases, the property taxes it's not reassessed for property tax purposes unless you sell. So the sale of that property actually results in an increase in the property tax value for property tax computation purposes. And then, of course, every transaction you have, the local governments have the documentary transfer taxes and recording fees and other transaction costs as well. All of that would go away if 1031 exchanges, we're assuming, would be completely eliminated. So it's when you have local and state budgets that are so strained because of COVID-19, this is also an issue that needs to be taken into consideration on how it would impact local government budgets, depending on how all that unwinds.
Yeah, Bill, that's a great point. I know here in Colorado, they're projecting that we're going to have revenues that are down by 30 to 35% because with all the shutdowns and all the restaurants operating at, just a fraction of capacity, we're not having sales tax revenue. We're not having all the traditional sources of revenue, and we don't have people shopping locally as much, creating tax revenue. So we've got people buying online through Amazon or other websites, right? But they're not necessarily shopping around the corner. They're certainly not able to go out and have as many meals out and all that revenue. So that's a real important point. And Bill, you mentioned it earlier, but I think one of the pieces that I think is probably most important to communicate, and Bill made a great point. We don't know how many people we have on this or listening to this that may have a connection with somebody in Congress or a representative or somebody that's close to somebody in government. So, keep in mind, as we do this, Bill and I, through the years, we educate. We're often surprised, who has a connection with somebody who's really critically placed and can really help educate other congressional representatives or other people. I will tell you, I spoke with somebody a few weeks ago that has a personal relationship with Joe Biden, and their particular business model, almost all of it is based on 1031 activity. And so they arranged a phone call with Joe Biden to talk about, hey, why this is important for the economy and just how much of their business depends on it. But one of the things to keep in mind, this is Bill mentioned an economic stimulant, which it is. The job creation, it goes up and down the food chain, right? Bill addressed that. You as commercial brokers, the title company, appraisals, people doing phase one environmentals, all the way up and down. And we have that on a sale and we have that on a purchase transaction, right? So it's almost a double whammy. 1031 exchanges, if you really boil it down to me, they equal jobs. It's job creation. We create jobs. We create transactional activity. And, the other piece we do is a lot of people do exchanges, and the studies have shown that people that do a 1031 exchange improve the replacement property. They throw about 12% more into it to improving it. Well, let's cycle back to what Bill was kind of leading off on about local economies. We want to improve assets, right? As we improve, if we take a Class C apartment complex and an exchange investor buys it, and in an improvement exchange, retrofits it, updates it, modernizes it, the landscaping inside, and brings in a better class of tenant, now you've not only got a better performing asset, but now you've got something that enhances the community, right? That does that. So there are all these associated benefits with 1031 that I think, once government representatives understand that, it becomes valuable. I'll share a story of one representative. I won't mention their name, but they bought a rental house and did their first 1031 exchange out of that into a field, and they do some duck hunting. And then they exchanged out of that property for a small winery. And I remember that representative sharing that they know that the ability to get into that winery was all due to 1031. And that's a really good example, right? A rental house, a field with duck hunting, and now you've got a winery, which is kind of more of a commercial building. 1031 does that. So if you're in the multifamily segment, who are your new up and coming buyers? Well, they're the people that are buying fourplexes today and eightplexes, and they're going to exchange out of that eightplex into a 16-unit apartment complex or a 30-unit complex. So 1031 really depends upon a lot of these new investors buying assets and working their way up, exchanging. And so your buyers on an apartment building don't come out of the blue. They started with that little investor that had one single family home and did some little exchanges. And then 20 years later, they now have a real estate portfolio and they're now buying apartment buildings or other commercial. But it's really the fuel to get that dynamic going. Now, one of the things I want to share, as Bill and I are talking, and we love to talk, he's talked for 4 more years than I have about this, so he's got me beat there. But what I do want to share with you is I want to leave you, one thing we want to make sure is that we give you the practical application. So there's a website that the FEA has put together. The website is 1031taxreform.com and then /take-action. So 1031taxreform.com, take action. And you can go there and it takes you 2 minutes. You just put in your information, your zip code, and there's a pre-formatted letter that just talks about the benefit of 1031. You can modify it, but I would encourage you, if you can take the time to contact your representatives through that website, it'll automatically go to the senators and congressmen that are associated with your district. Talk about that. If you're an office broker and you've got 30 other brokers in your office, forward that out and let them know, because as we're going to recover here, and we want to have a recovery and we want to see real estate being repurposed and recovering, as that happens, 1031 can be a key in helping that happen. It can help facilitate the transfer. And we'll talk in a moment about kind of what we're seeing in the market. I think that'll be kind of fascinating. 1031 tax reform. Yeah. So somebody had a question there from David. 1031 tax reform /take, and then it has a hyphen and then action. So put a hyphen between there. But if you go to that website, that's a really easy way to contact, your representatives and get the word out in a very positive fashion. And by the way, the letter is nonpartisan. Perfect. Thank you very much there. That's we got that on there. Excellent. Bill, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the things we've been seeing in the marketplace? Because it's been a wild year for 1031 activity, hasn't it?
Absolutely. As you're talking too, I want to go back real quick. I was thinking about something, and a lot of the folks I talk to view this as a tax strategy or view this as a real estate strategy. They don't realize the impact it would have on the overall economy. And you were addressing that from a number of different perspectives there. So one of the studies you mentioned, if you go back to the threat 5 years ago-ish, one of the things they discovered is that if 1031 exchanges were eliminated, GDP, which is a measure of the entire US economy, would drop, and I'm talking off the top of my head, but I think it was 0.8%. And at the time, GDP was about 1.9 to 2%. So that's like a 40 to 45% drop in the economy if 1031 exchanges go away. And that goes back to the comment Scott made where, if you don't do a sale, then you don't have two title companies and two escrow companies, an appraiser and lender, et cetera. So all of that revenue goes away and that reduces the economic benefits to the entire country. So this is not just a tax or a real estate matter, it's an economic matter that affects everybody. And that's why it's really key to get the message out there. And then to comment a little further, about the, going to that, the link, it's kind of like a vote against the change. It expresses your opinion as to what you feel should or should not be done. And congressional offices tally those votes, if you will, and it tells them what their constituents' perspective is, what their opinions are, and what they want or don't want. So the more people who say, I don't want 1031 to be eliminated or restricted or reduced or what have you, the more they realize that's important to their constituents. So it's really important that all of you do exactly as Scott suggested, because that gets your vote out there. And then referring to the trends, we've seen a lot of interesting trends. Now I'm in California, and we see a lot of people exchanging out of California. We have had, of course, COVID-19 and all of those issues. So we see people starting to repurpose retail properties. I'm getting out of retail, what am I going to go do? But we also have all sorts of legislative initiatives that kind of make you scratch your head. I mean, everyone I talk to, no matter what party they're in, they just go, I don't get this. And we've had rent control issues and property reassessment for property tax purpose issues and things like that. So seeing a lot of people exchange out, and in a lot of cases, they're going to either the Sunshine Belt, the Texas and the Florida, or they're going to states that do not have income taxes. And so that's certainly a big trend that we've seen.
Hey, Bill, could you touch upon, speaking of California, so our company's based in California as well. And honestly, California and the West Coast, we're really years ahead of the rest of the country, and they've seen such massive appreciation that the 1031 exchange makes so much sense, right? Your choice is either pay a lot in taxes or do a 1031 and redeploy that. But Bill, since you're in California, I'll cue this up for you, but there's something unique I'm finding some investors are not aware of. If you sell a relinquished property in California, and then you're going to relocate out of state, kind of explain what the rules are there with California, because I'm not sure everybody realizes, what that's all about and what that entails down the road.
Good point. And so we've affectionately nicknamed that as an industry, the California Clawback. and for years, California has taken the position that if you sell California property, you 1031 exchange out of state and buy in one of the other states as your replacement property, that it's tax deferred at that point. But in the future, if you sell and cash out, you will have to pay, quote unquote, California's fair share of the taxes. So that's a whole other debatable issue, but so that's the current position. For years, though, they had no ability to really track that. And January 1st, 2013, they rolled out a mechanism now where if you sell California property, 1031 exchange out of state, you have to report to California every single year going forward as to what the status of that property is. And as long as you keep exchanging or you pass on and get a step up in cost basis, California gets nothing. But if you ever sell and cash out, then California wants their quote unquote fair share. So it's something that you need to be aware of. Even a lot of tax advisors don't know that you have to go through that. The other issue that's interesting is, there was a Tax Reform Act of 2017, and that eliminated personal property exchanges. So now only real property qualifies at the federal level. Now, California still conforms to the January 1st, 2015 1031 exchange code. They didn't update that and conform to with the Tax Reform Act. So in California, you can still do personal property exchanges. So you defer the tax on the sale of the personal property, but you'd have to pay the federal tax on the personal property. So that's one of the unique issues you see in California as well.
Yeah. By the way, there was a question that was tossed out in the chat, and I'm going to bring it up. Both Bill and I want to be cautious about proposals, because somebody proposes something, it's got to work through the legislative process. They call that making sausage back in DC, which means, they grind and it, you've got an idea and it gets modified and then it comes out the other end, and it may be a little different than the initial proposal. One of the people talked about the fact that Joe Biden has proposed eliminating a step up in basis. So obviously, for those of us that do exchanges, your basis rolls over to the replacement property. So you have a higher value, but you've got a lot of gain because you've got a very low basis. Eliminating the ability to pass on that appreciated property with that step up in basis would put a pretty significant tax hit on heirs and people to do that. But I'll give you my take on this right now. We don't know the makeup. Remember, there's all that uncertainty that Bill kind of opened up with. If we end up with the Senate being Republican, we may get some of these things proposed, and maybe they meet in the middle. I'm with Bill on this one. I think divided government is healthy, right? We have different viewpoints, but working together to try and find some middle ground, that's the way our system's supposed to function. It hasn't been that great recently, but there are things that people on both sides of the aisle can agree upon that are good. We're hoping that with your input, 1031 will be one of those things that they realize, gosh, we've had something a part of the tax code for a century. This would be the stupidest thing to mess around with. I mean, that's really what we want to do. And Bill, your point about constituents was, right on the money. So many times when I'm talking to people in DC, they want to know not what's happening nationally, but they want to know about their people in their backyard. So if you can send a letter and do that communication at that 1031 tax reform /take-action, it makes a big difference. And if you have a personal illustration, I know of somebody right now that has a retail building that's being repurposed, and they shared that with somebody in Congress, that a building that they knew about was being revitalized. It was just sitting there vacant, but the exchange, somebody's coming in with an improvement exchange, and they're revitalizing that and bringing it back to life. Those stories are really, really impactful, because at the end of the day, our representatives, they're supposed to represent us in our district and our needs. And so it really is important to kind of be a vocal mouthpiece sharing that. And if we've got a lot of voices that saying these are just good for the economy overall, and you heard Bill mention the impact on GDP. Well, it certainly is there. I can tell you, looking what's happening here, and I'll move into kind of the trends of what we're seeing. I'm seeing the same thing Bill is. People coming out of California and they're going to Texas, Florida, Tennessee, Wyoming. So they're either going to a Sunbelt state where there's a lot of growth, or they're going to move out of California and take their small business with them and go to a state with no taxes. So that's a big trend. The other one, and I'm here in Colorado, we've seen this all over the place. Because of what we're doing right now on Zoom and people working out of home offices, there are many people that are realizing they maybe don't have to necessarily live in the city where their building is. They can work remotely. So I can tell you right now in Long Island, the properties on the east end of Long Island, so the Hamptons in that area, they appreciated this summer over 20% because people in New York City went to the Hamptons to stay out of all the chaos and some of the concerns with the virus in the city, and they're staying there. In Colorado, we're seeing the same thing. Areas like Vail and Aspen and Steamboat Springs, tremendous increase in demand. I've seen properties go up $100,000 in the last 6 months in the mountains because people are saying, I think I maybe want to work remote. It kind of gets me out of the chaos going on some of the cities. It gets me away from the virus and I can still work. And so we're even seeing 1031 exchange investors maybe buying a second home that they'll hold for investment purposes. Thanks, Todd, for the heads up there. That they'll hold for investment purposes. And 5 minutes, it was very clear. Thank you. So a second home can be done. A second home can be another type of asset. One thing I want to mention when we look at 1031 too is that it is so broad, right? We do conservation easements, agricultural easements. A cell tower is called a perpetual communication easement. Certain oil and gas programs, air rights, water rights, DST, a Delaware statutory trust. That part of the marketplace is on fire, where people can go into an investment that's relatively passive, right? They're going to own a slice of a larger building with a bunch of co-owners, but somebody else is going to take on those management responsibilities. So, that niche of the marketplace is exploding as people are looking for maybe exit strategies where they can come out of active management and maybe go into more passive management. So keep in mind, then I mentioned, ranches, farms, a vacation home held for investment. So 1031 is very, very broad. Any real property qualifies. And I'll just share one thing and I'll kick it back over to Bill for some comments. But we had some proposed Treasury regulations defining what real property is. So those came out earlier in the year. And we as an industry gave some comments and on areas of clarification. What Bill and I have heard through our trade association is most likely those regulations will be finalized before the end of 2020. So within the next month, most likely, remember we got a lot of things happening in DC. These are, I think, unusual times would be a fair way to say it. But we might get those final Treasury regulations. So prior to 2019 tax reform, we did personal and real property, as Bill mentioned, you can in California. Now we're going to get it clarified. What is the definition of real property? And we'll get those regulations, and that'll add a little bit of certainty. It's not going to be a game changer, but I think for Bill and I and for our customers, it'll provide clarity on exactly what is the definition of real property in some of those areas that are a little fuzzy.
And I know we've got a couple minutes left. Todd, are there any questions that you wanted us to address on what we've covered, or anybody else that have questions they want to post?
Yeah, if you're on, put something in the chat room real quick. Let us know what your questions are.
Yeah, Bill and I welcome the time to take your questions live. And if you want, you got Bill Exeter with Exeter Exchange, Scott Saunders, Asset Preservation. We're happy afterwards. But yeah, if you got any questions for us, we'd love to make sure we answer your questions on anything 1031 related.
We'll wait if there's any other questions. Just one quick comment is along the same lines that Scott mentioned. We're also seeing folks that are exchanging out downtown urban areas. So that was the trend for the last 10 years. Let's go into urbanized areas. Let's live downtown. We don't need a car. We can just walk here and there. There's a lot of rentals down there. And now because of COVID-19, people are thinking, wow, this density may not be a good thing. So we're seeing a lot of people also selling out of the densely populated urban areas and exchanging into maybe the suburban markets or even out of state, just to get away from the exposure to the virus.
Yeah, absolutely. Saying the same thing. Yeah, some of the suburbs weren't looking all that appealing. Everybody was going downtown, and all of a sudden the suburbs look real appealing to a lot of people in a lot of secondary markets. Was that a question I saw pop up there?
Yeah, the question was, how can you exchange into a second home? Excellent question. So what we have to be careful with is, for 1031 purposes, the property you sell and the property you acquire have to be held for qualified use. So that's rental, investment, or business use. A second home typically is used for personal use. So as Scott mentioned, you could buy the property, but you have to have the intent to hold it for rental, investment, or business use. So rent it out for a couple of years, long enough to prove intent to hold for rental. And then later your intent can change. You can convert it to a second home or a primary residence, but initially your intent needs to be held for rental.